Sarah Martinez thought her biggest challenge would be learning the layout of the massive naval base. She was wrong. From the moment she stepped off the transport bus at Naval Station Norfolk, whispers followed her like shadows. The sailors smirked. The officers rolled their eyes. Even the cafeteria workers seemed to shake their heads as she passed by with her crisp new uniform and regulation duffel bag. "Another daddy's girl," someone muttered behind her. "Bet she won't last a month," came another voice. What they didn't know was that Sarah had earned her way here through 15 years of relentless dedication, starting as an 18-year-old recruit who scrubbed decks and worked night shifts to pay for advanced training. What they couldn't see beneath her calm exterior was a mind that had revolutionized naval logistics at 3 different bases, a leader who had saved millions in government spending, and someone who had earned the respect of admirals across 2 oceans. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when you're about to become their commanding officer. This is the true story of how an entire naval base tried to break the new girl until they discovered she was about to become their boss. The Virginia morning air was thick with humidity as Sarah Martinez stepped off the military transport bus at Naval Station Norfolk. Her regulation black duffel bag hit the concrete with a soft thud, and she adjusted the collar of her dress blue uniform one final time before taking her first real look at what would be her new home for the foreseeable future. Norfolk was massive. The largest naval station in the world, it sprawled across thousands of acres with its own zip code, hospital, fire department, and enough personnel to populate a small city. Aircraft carriers loomed in the distance like floating skyscrapers, their grey hulls reflecting the early morning sun. The sound of jet engines roared overhead as F-18 Super Hornets practiced touch-and-go landings on nearby runways. Sarah had been here once before, 3 years ago, for a brief inspection tour. But arriving as a permanent assignment felt different, more final. More intimidating even for someone with her background. She pulled out her orders packet and checked the address one more time. Building 1482, Office Suite 200. The base administration building where she would spend the next several weeks in what the Navy euphemistically called transition orientation. In reality, it was a period of evaluation, observation, and integration, designed to determine how well she would fit into the existing command structure. What made Sarah's situation unusual was that very few people on the base knew exactly what her role would be once the transition period ended. Her orders were classified at a level that required special clearance to access, and the rumor mill had been working overtime trying to figure out why a relatively unknown officer had been transferred to such a high-profile assignment. The first sign of trouble came before she had even made it to the administration building. Walking across the main plaza, Sarah noticed a group of junior officers gathered near the base exchange. Their conversation stopped abruptly as she approached, and she caught the tail end of what sounded like snickering. "Excuse me," she said politely, approaching the group. "Could you point me toward Building 1482? The officers exchanged glances. A young lieutenant with close-cropped brown hair and an expression that suggested he found something amusing spoke up. "You must be the new transfer everyone's been talking about." "I suppose I am," Sarah replied evenly. "Lieutenant Commander Jackson," he said, not offering to shake hands. "Most people just call me Jack. You're causing quite a stir around here, you know. Not often we get mystery assignments dropping in from Washington." Sarah recognized the fishing expedition for what it was. In her 15 years of naval service, she had learned to read between the lines of casual conversation. Jackson was probing for information, trying to determine her rank, her role, and most importantly, her place in the pecking order. "Sarah Martinez," she replied, deliberately omitting her rank. "And I'm just here to do whatever job they assign me." Jackson's smile grew wider, and Sarah realized she had just made her first mistake. By not asserting her authority or revealing her rank, she had allowed him to assume she was either his junior or at best his equal. In military culture, that assumption would spread faster than gossip. "Well, Martinez," Jackson said, emphasizing her last name with a slight drawl. "Building 1482 is that way. Hope you're ready to learn how we do things around here. Norfolk's got its own way of operating, if you know what I mean." The other officers chuckled, and Sarah caught the underlying message clearly enough. She was the outsider. They were the established group, and they intended to make sure she understood the hierarchy from day one. Sarah thanked them and walked in the direction Jackson had indicated, but she could feel their eyes following her. Behind her, she heard someone say, $5 says she's out of here before Christmas." "You're on," came the reply. "I give her 2 months tops." The administration building was the imposing concrete structure that had clearly been built during the military's brutalist architecture phase of the 1960s. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of industrial-strength cleaning solution mixed with old coffee hung in the air. Sarah found Suite 200 after a brief search and knocked on the heavy wooden door. A voice called for her to enter, and she stepped into an outer office where a middle-aged woman in a crisp navy uniform sat behind a desk covered with neat stacks of paperwork. "You must be Commander Martinez," the woman said, rising from her chair. "I'm Chief Petty Officer Williams. Welcome to Norfolk." Sarah noticed immediately that Williams had used her correct rank, which meant that unlike the officers outside, the administrative staff had been properly briefed on her arrival. It also meant that Jackson and his friends had deliberately chosen to treat her as a subordinate despite having access to information that would have told them otherwise. "Thank you, Chief," Sarah replied. "I'm here for my orientation appointment." Williams consulted a schedule book on her desk. "Captain Morrison is waiting for you. He's been looking forward to meeting you." She led Sarah to an inner office where a tall, grey-haired man in his 50s sat behind a desk reviewing what appeared to be personnel files. Captain Morrison looked up as they entered and immediately stood to attention. "Commander Martinez," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Norfolk. Please, have a seat." Morrison's office was decorated with the usual collection of military memorabilia, plaques from various commands, photographs of ships and aircraft, and a bookshelf filled with naval regulations and leadership manuals. But Sarah noticed something else that caught her attention. A framed photograph showing Morrison shaking hands with Admiral Patricia Hamilton, the current Chief of Naval Operations. "I trust your flight from Washington was comfortable?" Morrison asked as they both sat down. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Morrison studied her for a moment, and Sarah sensed he was trying to reconcile her appearance with whatever he had been told about her background. At 33, she knew she looked younger than many officers of her rank, and her slight build often led people to underestimate her capabilities. "I'll be frank with you, Commander," Morrison said finally. "Your assignment here has generated quite a bit of curiosity. It's not often we receive transfer orders that come directly from the Pentagon with instructions to provide full support and cooperation without explanation of the specific."
Sarah had expected this conversation. "I understand the situation is unusual, sir."
"What I need to know is whether you're prepared for what that means in practical terms."
Norfolk is a large base with established procedures and relationships that have been built over years. When someone arrives with orders that suggest special treatment or authority that isn't clearly defined, it can create tensions. "I'm here to do my job, whatever that turns out to be," Sarah said. "I have no intention of disrupting existing operations or undermining established authority." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Good to hear. Now, I've been instructed to provide you with complete access to base facilities and personnel records. You'll be given an office in this building and administrative support as needed. Your orientation will include briefings on current operations, staff introductions, and familiarization with ongoing projects." He paused and leaned back in his chair. "What I haven't been told is how long this orientation period is expected to last, or what happens at the end of it." Sarah chose her words carefully. "I believe that will depend on how quickly I can get up to speed on current operations and assess the overall situation." It was a diplomatic answer that revealed nothing while suggesting she had some kind of evaluative role. Morrison's expression indicated he understood the implications. "Very well," he said. "Chief Williams will set up your office and schedule your initial briefings. Is there anything specific you need to get started?" "Just access to the personnel and operational files we discussed. I prefer to begin with a comprehensive overview before diving into specifics." "Understood. One more thing, Commander." Morrison's tone became more serious. "I want you to know that you'll have my full support during your time here. But I also want you to understand that this is a tight-knit community. People talk, and word spreads quickly. How you handle yourself in the first few days will largely determine how you're received going forward." Sarah recognized the warning for what it was. Morrison was telling her that her encounter with Jackson and his group was probably already being discussed throughout the base, and that first impressions would be crucial. "I appreciate the advice, sir," she said. "I'll keep that in mind." After the meeting, Chief Williams escorted Sarah to a small but well-equipped office on the same floor. It had a desk, computer, filing cabinet, and a window that looked out over the main base thoroughfare. Williams provided her with building access cards, computer logging credentials, and a thick binder containing base policies and procedures. "Your first briefing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 0800, Williams explained. "You'll meet with the department heads for an overview of current operations. Is there anything else you need today?" "Actually, yes," Sarah said. "I'd like to take a walk-in tour of the base this afternoon, get familiar with the layout, and maybe grab lunch at the enlisted dining facility." Williams looked surprised. The enlisted dining facility? Most officers eat at the club or in the office. I found that some of the best conversations happen over a meal with the sailors who actually do the work. Sarah replied with a smile. It was a true statement, but it also served another purpose. Sarah had learned long ago that information flowed differently at different levels of the military hierarchy. Officers often told her what they thought she wanted to hear, while enlisted personnel were more likely to give her unfiltered opinions about what was really happening on a base. Williams provided her with a base map and directions to the dining facility, and Sarah spent the rest of the morning reviewing personnel files and organizational charts. By lunchtime, she had a basic understanding of how Norfolk was structured and who the key players were. The enlisted dining facility was located in a large, modern building near the main barracks complex. Sarah arrived during the lunch rush to find the place buzzing with activity. She went through the serving line, selecting a turkey sandwich and chips, then looked around for a place to sit. The reaction to her presence was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations quieted as she walked past tables filled with sailors in working uniforms. Some nodded politely, others simply stared. A few appeared to be whispering to their table mates, and Sarah caught fragments of conversation that suggested word of the new mystery officer had already spread to the enlisted ranks. She found an empty table near a group of petty officers who appeared to be discussing maintenance schedules for some kind of equipment. As she sat down, one of them, a woman with short blonde hair and grease stains on her coveralls, looked over and smiled. "Excuse me, Mom," the woman said. "Are you the new officer everyone's been talking about?" "Depends on what they're saying," Sarah replied with a grin. The woman laughed. "Nothing bad, just curious. We don't get many new commanders around here, especially ones who eat in the enlisted dining hall." "Petty Officer Second Class Rodriguez," the woman said, introducing herself. "I work in the motor pool. Nice to meet you, Rodriguez. What's the motor pool's biggest challenge these days?" It was a simple question, but Rodriguez's face lit up with the expression of someone who had been waiting for someone in authority to ask. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah listened as Rodriguez and her colleagues explained the chronic parts shortages, outdated equipment, and scheduling conflicts that made their jobs more difficult than necessary. Sarah took mental notes of everything they told her, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she understood both the technical and administrative aspects of their concerns. By the time she finished her sandwich, she had learned more about the practical challenges facing Norfolk support personnel than she would have discovered in hours of reading official reports. As she prepared to leave, Rodriguez stopped her. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you here to shut something down?" "Because that's what some people are saying. That Washington is sending someone to evaluate whether we're being efficient enough." Sarah could see the worry in Rodriguez's eyes and realized that rumors about her purpose had taken on a life of their own. Morale problems could be just as damaging as operational inefficiencies, and she made a mental note to address the speculation before it spread further.
"I'm here to learn how things work," Sarah said honestly.
"But I'm not here to shut anything down or eliminate jobs. Sometimes fresh eyes can help identify ways to make everyone's job easier." Rodriguez looked relieved, and Sarah realized she had just passed an important test. The enlisted personnel would be watching to see whether she was someone who understood their concerns, or just another officer who would implement changes from an ivory tower perspective. Walking back to the administration building, Sarah reflected on her first day at Norfolk. The challenges were already becoming clear. She was seen as an outsider with uncertain authority and unknown intentions. The officer corps was skeptical and possibly hostile. The enlisted personnel were worried about job security, and she had roughly 3 weeks to navigate these dynamics before her real assignment began. What none of them knew yet was that Sarah had faced similar challenges before, and that her track record of transforming naval operations had earned her the attention of the highest levels of military leadership. But revealing that information prematurely could make her situation worse rather than better. For now, she would continue to observe, learn, and build relationships, one conversation at a time. The real test would come when people discovered exactly why she had been sent to Norfolk and what authority she would wield once her orientation period ended. As she reached the administration building, Sarah noticed Jackson and several other officers gathered near the main entrance. Their conversation stopped as she approached, and she could feel them evaluating her every move. She nodded politely as she passed, but made no attempt to engage them in conversation. Inside her office, Sarah found a stack of briefing materials that Williams had left on her desk, along with a note indicating that her schedule for the following day had been finalized. She spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing operational reports and budget analyses, building a foundation of knowledge that would serve her well in the weeks to come. By the time she left the office that evening, Sarah had begun to formulate a strategy for her time at Norfolk. She would continue to maintain a low profile while gathering information. She would build relationships with personnel at all levels, focusing especially on the enlisted sailors, who could provide insights into day-to-day operations. And she would carefully document everything she learned, building a comprehensive picture of the base's strengths and weaknesses. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly the rumor mill would begin working against her, or how determined some people would be to undermine her efforts before they even understood what those efforts entailed. The next few weeks would test not only her professional skills, but also her ability to navigate the complex social and political dynamics that govern life on one of the Navy's most important installations. But Sarah Martinez had not risen through the ranks by avoiding difficult assignments or backing down from challenges. She had earned her position through competence, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to making the Navy more effective and efficient. Norfolk would be her biggest test yet, but it would not be her first time proving that sometimes the most unlikely person in the room is exactly the right person for the job. The morning briefing room felt like a gladiator arena as Sarah entered at exactly 0800. 8 department heads sat around a polished conference table, their faces ranging from curious to openly skeptical. She recognized Lieutenant Commander Jackson from the previous day, now wearing his full-dress uniform with ribbons that spoke of deployments and commendations. Beside him sat Commander Patricia Vance, the base's operations officer, whose reputation for running a tight ship was legendary throughout the fleet. Captain Morrison stood as Sarah entered. "Gentlemen and ladies, meet Commander Martinez. She'll be observing our operations during her orientation period." The phrase, "observing our operations," hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had heard Morrison use those exact words deliberately, knowing they would be interpreted as a threat by anyone who had something to hide or who felt their territory was being invaded. Commander Vance was the first to speak. "Commander Martinez, I understand you're from the Pentagon. What's your background?" It was a direct question that demanded a direct answer, but Sarah had learned to navigate these waters carefully. Too much information too early could backfire, while too little could make her seem evasive or weak. "I've spent the last few years working on operational efficiency projects," Sarah replied. "Before that, I had assignments at Pearl Harbor, San Diego, and Mayport." "Efficiency projects," Jackson repeated, his tone suggesting he found the phrase distasteful. "That sounds like consultant work." "More like troubleshooting," Sarah said evenly. "When operations aren't meeting their potential, sometimes it helps to have someone take a fresh look at the systems and procedures." The room fell silent. Sarah realized she had just confirmed everyone's worst fears about her assignment. In military culture, efficiency experts and troubleshooters were often code words for people sent to identify waste, redundancy, and personnel who could be eliminated. Commander Vance leaned forward. "Are we having efficiency problems here at Norfolk that we should be aware of?" It was a test question, designed to put Sarah on the defensive. If she said yes, she would be implying that the current leadership was inadequate. If she said no, they would wonder why she was there at all. "Every large operation can benefit from periodic review," Sarah said diplomatically. "I'm here to learn how things work, not to judge or criticize." "But if you were to find problems," Jackson pressed, "what would happen then?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Then I would discuss them with the appropriate leadership and work together to find solutions." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't a lie either. Sarah's real authority went far beyond making suggestions and working collaboratively, but revealing that now would turn the briefing into an adversarial confrontation rather than an information-gathering session. The briefings themselves were professional, but clearly designed to overwhelm rather than inform. Each department head provided detailed presentations filled with technical jargon, budget figures, and operational statistics that would have been difficult for anyone to absorb in a single session. Sarah recognized the strategy: flood her with information while providing no context or analysis that would help her understand what the numbers actually meant. Commander Vance's presentation on flight operations was particularly dense. She rattled off statistics about sortie rates, maintenance schedules, fuel consumption, and pilot training hours without pausing to explain how these metrics related to overall mission effectiveness. When Sarah asked for clarification on what appeared to be a significant decrease in training hours over the past 6 months, Vance's response was crisp and defensive. "Training hours fluctuate based on operational requirements and aircraft availability," she said. "We maintain full readiness status regardless of temporary variations in training schedules." It was a non-answer that avoided addressing Sarah's actual question, but challenging it directly would have been seen as aggressive. Sarah made a note to review the training records independently. Lieutenant Commander Jackson's briefing on personnel matters was equally uninformative. He provided overall staffing numbers and retention rates but avoided discussing any specific challenges or problem areas. When Sarah asked about enlisted personnel concerns, Jackson's response was dismissive. "Morale is high across all ratings," he said. "We conduct regular climate surveys and maintain open communication channels for any issues that arise." Sarah thought about her conversation with Petty Officer Rodriguez the day before and wondered if Jackson was deliberately glossing over problems or genuinely unaware of them. Either possibility was concerning. The pattern continued through the morning. Each presenter provided mountains of data while revealing virtually nothing about actual operational challenges, resource constraints, or areas where improvements might be needed. By the time the briefings ended at noon, Sarah had learned more about the department heads' personalities than about the base's actual operations. As the meeting broke up, Commander Vance approached her. "Commander Martinez, I hope you found our presentations informative." "Very thorough," Sarah replied neutrally. "Good. We pride ourselves on running efficient operations here at Norfolk. I think you'll find that most of our systems are already optimized for maximum effectiveness." The message was clear. "We don't need fixing, so don't try to fix us." Sarah smiled politely and thanked Vance for her time, but she could feel the walls going up around her. The department heads were circling the wagons, and her 3-week orientation period was beginning to look like a carefully orchestrated campaign to demonstrate that Norfolk was running perfectly and needed no outside intervention.
After lunch, Sarah decided to take a different approach.
Instead of scheduling formal meetings with senior personnel, she would conduct informal visits to actual work sites, where she could observe operations firsthand and talk to the people doing the actual work. Her first stop was the aircraft maintenance hangar, where she had noticed significant activity during her base tour the day before. The hangar was enormous, large enough to house several F-18 Super Hornets simultaneously, with work platforms, diagnostic equipment, and parts storage areas organized in a complex but seemingly efficient layout. Sarah found the maintenance chief, Senior Chief Petty Officer Williams, supervising a team of mechanics working on the engine of a fighter jet. Williams was a compact, energetic woman in her 40s, whose coveralls were stained with hydraulic fluid and whose hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had been working on aircraft for decades. "Excuse me, Senior Chief," Sarah said, approaching carefully. "I'm Commander Martinez. I was wondering if I could observe your operations for a few minutes." Williams looked surprised but pleased that an officer had bothered to visit her work area. "Of course, ma'am. What would you like to see?" "Whatever you're working on. I'm trying to understand how all the pieces fit together." For the next hour, Williams provided Sarah with a detailed explanation of aircraft maintenance procedures, parts inventory systems, and scheduling challenges that would have been impossible to understand from Commander Vance's PowerPoint presentation. Williams was knowledgeable, articulate, and clearly passionate about her work, but she also didn't hesitate to point out problems that were making her job more difficult than necessary. "Our biggest challenge is parts availability," Williams explained as they walked past rows of expensive diagnostic equipment. "We have to order most components through a centralized system that can take weeks or even months for delivery. Meanwhile, aircraft sit grounded waiting for parts that might cost $50 but take 6 weeks to arrive." "Have you raised this with the Supply Chain Management Office?" Sarah asked. Williams laughed, but not with amusement. "Ma'am, I've been raising it for 3 years. The standard response is that the system is designed for cost control and that we need to plan better in advance. But you can't plan for every possible component failure, especially on aircraft that are being pushed to their operational limits." Sarah made careful notes of everything Williams told her, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she understood both the technical and administrative aspects of the maintenance operation. By the time their conversation ended, she had identified several specific areas where procedural changes could potentially improve efficiency without requiring additional resources. Her next stop was the base supply depot, where she hoped to get the other side of the parts availability story. The depot was a massive warehouse complex that stored everything from jet engines to office supplies, managed by a team of logistics specialists who tracked millions of dollars worth of inventory. Lieutenant David Park, the depot officer, seemed nervous when Sarah introduced herself and asked for a tour of the facilities. Unlike Senior Chief Williams, who had been eager to discuss her operations, Park's answers were cautious and by the book. "Our inventory management system meets all Navy requirements," he said as they walked past towering shelves of carefully organized parts and supplies. "We maintain accuracy rates above regulatory minimums and process requisitions within established timeframes." "What about priority items for aircraft that are grounded?" Sarah asked. All emergency requisitions receive expedited processing. Park replied without providing any specific details about what expedited processing actually meant in practical terms. Sarah pressed gently for more information. Senior Chief Williams mentioned that some aircraft parts can take weeks to arrive even when aircraft are out of service. Is there a way to prioritize those requests? Park's response was defensive. We follow established procurement procedures for all requests. If maintenance personnel believe their requirements need special consideration, they should submit formal requests through the proper channels. It was becoming clear that the parts availability problem Williams had described was caused at least partially by rigid adherence to procedures that didn't account for operational realities. Park was following the rules exactly as written, while Williams was dealing with the consequences of those rules in the real world. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon visiting other operational areas: the motor pool where she had met Rodriguez, the communications center where technicians maintained base-wide network systems, and the security office where personnel managed access control and emergency response procedures. In each location, she found the same pattern. The people actually doing the work were knowledgeable, dedicated, and frustrated by systems and procedures that made their jobs more difficult than necessary. Meanwhile, the officers managing those systems seemed either unaware of the problems or unwilling to acknowledge them. By late afternoon, Sarah had filled several pages of notes with specific examples of operational inefficiencies that could be addressed with relatively simple policy changes. But she had also identified a more serious problem: a disconnect between senior leadership and operational reality that suggested deeper organizational issues. As she returned to her office, Sarah encountered Jackson waiting near the administration building entrance. His expression suggested their meeting was not coincidental. "Commander Martinez," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "How was your first day of observation?" "Educational," Sarah replied carefully. "I hope you found everything in order. Norfolk has a reputation for excellence that we work hard to maintain." There was an edge to Jackson's voice that suggested he knew exactly what Sarah had been doing that afternoon and wasn't pleased about it. Word of her visits to operational areas had apparently reached the officer community faster than she had expected. "I'm always impressed by the dedication of Navy personnel," Sarah said diplomatically. Jackson stepped closer, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone. "You know, Commander, some of us have been wondering about your assignment here. 3 weeks is a long time for an orientation, especially for someone with your background." Sarah recognized the fishing expedition for what it was. Jackson was trying to get her to reveal more information about her purpose at Norfolk, probably so he could better coordinate resistance to whatever changes she might eventually recommend. "I'm just here to learn," she said with a shrug. "The Navy invests a lot in officers like me, so they want to make sure we understand how large operations work." It was a plausible explanation that revealed nothing while deflecting further questions. Jackson's expression suggested he wasn't satisfied with her response, but he couldn't push harder without being openly confrontational. "Well," he said finally, "if you have any questions about how we do things around here, feel free to ask. Those of us who have been at Norfolk for a while are always happy to help newcomers understand our culture." The emphasis on our culture was unmistakable. Jackson was warning her that Norfolk had established ways of doing things, and that outsiders who tried to change those ways would face organized resistance. "I appreciate that," Sarah said. "I'll definitely reach out if I need guidance." As Jackson walked away, Sarah realized that her afternoon visits had already generated pushback from the officer community. They were watching her activities closely and coordinating their responses to limit her access to information that might challenge their preferred narrative about Norfolk's operations. That evening, Sarah stayed late in her office reviewing the notes she had taken during her conversations with operational personnel. The picture emerging from those discussions was troubling, but not unexpected. Norfolk was a large, complex organization with entrenched systems and procedures that had evolved over decades. Some of those systems were working well, but others had become obstacles to efficiency and effectiveness. The parts procurement problem was just one example. Williams needed components quickly to keep aircraft operational, but Park was required to follow procedures that prioritized cost control over speed. Neither of them had the authority to modify the system, and the officers who did have that authority seemed either unaware of the problem or unwilling to address it. Sarah had seen similar patterns at other bases, and she knew that solving them required more than just identifying the problems. It required understanding the political and organizational dynamics that had created the problems in the first place, and that would resist efforts to change them. What concerned her most was the growing evidence that Norfolk's senior officers were more interested in protecting their reputations than in addressing operational challenges. Commander Vance's evasive answers about training hours, Jackson's defensiveness about personnel issues, and Park's rigid adherence to procedures all suggested an organizational culture that valued conformity over innovation. As Sarah prepared to leave for the day, she found herself thinking about the conversation with Captain Morrison. He had warned her that Norfolk was a tight-knit community where first impressions mattered, and that people would be watching to see how she handled herself. What he hadn't mentioned was that some of those people would be actively working to undermine her efforts from the beginning. The next few weeks would require careful navigation of competing interests and personalities. Sarah needed to continue gathering information while avoiding direct confrontations that would harden resistance to her presence. She needed to build allies among the operational personnel while managing the suspicions of the officer community. And she needed to document everything carefully so that when her orientation period ended, she would be prepared for whatever came next. But first, she needed to address the rumor mill that was threatening to turn her fact-finding mission into a morale crisis. Tomorrow, she would begin a more systematic effort to communicate with personnel at all levels, clarifying her role while continuing to gather the information she needed to understand how Norfolk really worked. As she locked her office and headed for the base lodging facility where she was staying temporarily, Sarah reflected on the challenges ahead. She had faced similar resistance before, but Norfolk was larger and more complex than her previous assignments. The stakes were higher, the politics more intricate, and the potential for both success and failure more significant. What she didn't yet know was that Jackson and several other officers were already planning their next move to limit her access and influence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges that would test her diplomatic skills and her determination to complete her mission despite organized resistance from people who saw her as a threat to their authority and comfortable routines. The knock on Sarah's office door came at 0730, 30 minutes before her scheduled appointment with the base financial management team. She opened it to find Chief Petty Officer Williams holding a steaming cup of coffee and wearing an expression that suggested she had something important to discuss. "Ma'am, do you have a minute?" Williams asked quietly. Sarah gestured for her to come in and close the door. Over the past week, Williams had become an invaluable source of institutional knowledge about how Norfolk actually functioned, as opposed to how it was supposed to function according to official procedures. "I thought you should know," Williams began, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk, "that word is spreading about your conversations with the work centers. Some of the department heads are not happy that you're talking to their people directly." Sarah wasn't surprised. Her systematic visits to operational areas had been generating detailed information about problems and inefficiencies that contradicted the rosy picture presented in the formal briefings. "What kind of pushback are we talking about?" Commander Vance sent out a memo yesterday requiring all personnel to report any informal meetings with visiting officers through their chain of command. Lieutenant Commander Jackson has been asking department heads to provide lists of anyone who has spoken with you. Williams paused to sip her coffee. "Ma'am, I've been in the Navy for 22 years, and I've never seen this level of concern about someone asking questions. What exactly are you here to do?" It was a fair question from someone who had been helpful and professional throughout Sarah's orientation. But answering it honestly would violate the operational security requirements of her assignment and could put Williams in a difficult position with her supervisors. "I'm gathering information about how Norfolk operates so that I can better understand Navy procedures and systems," Sarah said, sticking to her cover story. "But I'm concerned that some people are interpreting my questions as criticism or threats." Williams studied Sarah's face carefully. "Ma'am, with respect, most of us aren't stupid. You don't get assigned from the Pentagon for 3 weeks of orientation just to learn procedures. And you don't ask the kinds of detailed questions you've been asking unless you're looking for something specific." Sarah realized that her cover story was becoming less credible as time went on. The personnel she had been talking to were experienced professionals who could recognize when they were being evaluated, and her attempts to maintain the fiction that she was just a student observer were beginning to undermine her credibility. "Chief, all I can tell you is that I'm here to do a job, and that job requires me to understand how this base really works. I'm not here to get anyone in trouble or to eliminate positions." Williams nodded slowly. "I believe you, ma'am, but you should know that some people are getting scared. There are rumors that Washington is looking to make budget cuts, and that you're here to identify what can be eliminated. Have you heard these rumors from reliable sources?" "That's the thing," Williams said. "The rumors seem to be coming from the officer community, not from the enlisted personnel. It's like someone is deliberately spreading the word that your assignment is about downsizing." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Someone was actively working to undermine her mission by creating fear and resistance among the workforce. It was a sophisticated strategy that would make her job much more difficult while providing plausible cover for the people orchestrating it. Chief, I need you to help me understand something. In your experience, when the Navy wants to make budget cuts or eliminate programs, how do they usually go about it? Williams thought for a moment. Usually they send teams of auditors and efficiency experts who conduct formal reviews with lots of documentation and official procedures. They don't send individual officers to ask informal questions and observe daily operations. So, what I'm doing doesn't fit the pattern of a typical downsizing review. No, ma'am, it doesn't. Which is why some of us think there's something else going on here. After Williams left, Sarah spent the morning reviewing financial reports and budget analyses that had been provided by the Comptroller's office. Like everything else she had received from the senior staff, the documents were technically accurate but provided little insight into actual resource allocation or spending patterns. The base budget was enormous, reflecting Norfolk's size and mission scope. Hundreds of millions of dollars flowed through various accounts for personnel, operations, maintenance, and infrastructure. But the summary reports she had been given showed only aggregate numbers, without the detail needed to identify specific areas of concern. Sarah made a mental note to request more detailed financial data, knowing that such a request would likely trigger additional resistance from the financial management team. But without understanding how money was actually being spent, she couldn't assess whether resources were being used effectively. Her afternoon appointment was with Commander Lisa Patterson, the base's information systems officer, who was responsible for managing Norfolk's complex network of computers, communications equipment, and data systems. Patterson had requested the meeting, claiming she wanted to brief Sarah on cybersecurity procedures and network architecture. Patterson's office was filled with technical manuals, computer equipment, and multiple monitors displaying what appeared to be network status information. She was a tall, intense woman in her late 30s who had clearly risen through the technical ranks based on expertise rather than political skills. "Commander Martinez," Patterson said as Sarah entered, "I understand you've been asking questions about various operational areas around the base."
That's correct.
"I'm trying to get a comprehensive understanding of how everything works together." Patterson gestured for Sarah to sit down, then closed her office door carefully before returning to her desk. "I want to show you something, but I need your word that this conversation stays between us." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Patterson's tone suggested she was about to reveal something significant, possibly sensitive enough to explain why other officers had been trying to limit Sarah's access to information. "You have my word," Sarah said. Patterson turned one of her computer monitors towards Sarah and began navigating through what appeared to be a complex database system. "This is our integrated logistics management system. It tracks parts procurement, inventory levels, maintenance schedules, and resource allocation across all base operations." Sarah recognized the system as a sophisticated tool that should have provided real-time visibility into exactly the kinds of operational challenges she had been hearing about from personnel like Senior Chief Williams. The system can generate reports showing procurement delays, inventory shortages, maintenance backlogs, and resource conflicts, Patterson continued. "It's designed to help commanders identify problems before they impact operations." "That sounds like exactly what you would need to manage an operation this size," Sarah said. Patterson's expression grew grim. "The problem is that most department heads don't use the system's analytical capabilities. They generate the minimum reports required for compliance purposes, but they ignore the data that could help them solve operational problems." She navigated to a different screen that showed a detailed analysis of aircraft parts procurement. "Look at this. The system has been flagging chronic delays in critical components for months. It even suggests alternative suppliers and expedited procurement procedures that could resolve most of the delays." Sarah studied the display, recognizing immediately that the system had identified solutions to the exact problems Senior Chief Williams had described. Have these recommendations been implemented? No. Commander Vance's response was that the current procedures are adequate and that changing them would require extensive coordination with higher headquarters. Patterson pulled up another report showing personnel scheduling conflicts, budget variances, and equipment utilization rates that painted a picture of systemic inefficiencies throughout the base. "The data is all here, but nobody wants to act on it because implementing the recommendations would require admitting that current procedures aren't working." Sarah was beginning to understand the real scope of the challenge at Norfolk. It wasn't just that operations could be improved, it was that the information needed to improve them was already available but was being ignored by the people with authority to make changes. "Commander Patterson, why are you showing me this?" "Because I've been trying to get senior leadership to pay attention to this data for 2 years, and I've been told repeatedly that the current systems are working fine," Meanwhile, I watched the same preventable problems occur over and over again because nobody wants to acknowledge that we could do better. Patterson's frustration was evident, but Sarah sensed there was more to her motivation than professional concern. Is there something else I should know? Patterson hesitated, then pulled up what appeared to be a budget analysis. 3 months ago, I was asked to provide a report on potential cost savings that could be achieved through better resource management. I used the system data to identify specific areas where procedural changes could save millions of dollars annually without impacting operations. What happened to the report? It was classified and filed away. I was told that the recommendations were too disruptive to implement and that questioning established procedures could be harmful to morale. Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Norfolk wasn't just resistant to change. It was actively suppressing information that could justify changes. Someone with significant authority was working to maintain the status quo regardless of its cost or effectiveness. Commander, do you still have copies of that analysis? Patterson looked nervous. I do, but sharing it without proper authorization could get me in serious trouble. I understand.
But if you were ordered to provide it to someone with appropriate clearance and need to know, would that resolve the authorization issue?
Yes, ma'am, it would. Sarah made a mental note to explore that possibility through official channels.
If Patterson's analysis was as comprehensive as it appeared, it could provide exactly the kind of documented evidence needed to justify the organizational changes that Sarah was beginning to believe Norfolk desperately needed. One more question, Sarah said. In your professional opinion, why do you think senior leadership is resistant to using data that could improve operations and save money? Patterson considered the question carefully. I think there are several factors. Some of it is genuine concern about disrupting operations that are working adequately, even if they could work better. Some of it is resistance to change in general, which is pretty common in large organizations. She paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. But I also think some of it is political. Making significant improvements would require acknowledging that previous leadership decisions were suboptimal, and it would require taking risks that could backfire and damage careers. After leaving Patterson's office, Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the base, processing what she had learned. The picture emerging from her 3 weeks of observation was more complex than she had initially expected. Norfolk wasn't just inefficient. It was systematically avoiding opportunities to become more efficient in order to protect the people responsible for current procedures. As she walked past the aircraft maintenance hangar, where she had first met Senior Chief Williams, Sarah reflected on the irony of the situation. The Navy had some of the most sophisticated management and analysis systems in the world, staffed by intelligent and dedicated professionals who understood both the problems and the solutions. But the organizational culture discouraged using those tools to actually solve problems. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Chief Williams. Commander, can you meet me at Building 847 at 1900? There's something you need to see. Building 847 was a maintenance facility on the far side of the base, away from the main administrative areas. Sarah agreed to the meeting, wondering what Williams had discovered that required such secrecy. She arrived at the building just as the sun was setting, finding Williams waiting near a side entrance. Ma'am, thank you for coming. I want to show you something, but we need to be careful about who sees us together. Williams led her into the building, which appeared to be a parts storage and repair facility. Rows of shelves held aircraft components in various stages of refurbishment, and workstations were equipped with specialized tools for electronics repair. This is our component repair shop, Williams explained. We refurbish parts that would otherwise have to be replaced with new ones costing thousands of dollars each. Sarah was impressed by the sophisticated equipment and the obvious expertise of the technicians working on complex electronic components. This looks like a significant cost-saving operation.
It is, ma'am.
We save the Navy millions of dollars every year by repairing components instead of buying new ones. The problem is that our work isn't being counted properly in the official statistics. Williams led Sarah to a computer terminal and showed her repair logs that documented the scope and value of the work being performed. According to our records, we've completed over 2,000 component repairs this year, with an average cost savings of $3,000 per repair. That's $6 million in savings, Sarah calculated quickly. Right. But when budget analysts look at our operations, they only see the cost of running the repair shop, not the money we're saving by avoiding new purchases. So on paper, we look like an expense center rather than a profit center. Sarah began to understand the implications. So when efficiency experts look for areas to cut costs, repair operations like this one would appear to be good candidates for elimination. Exactly. And that's what has everyone worried about your assignment. People think you're here to identify operations that can be cut without understanding the true value they provide. Williams showed Sarah additional documentation that revealed the full scope of the problem. The base's accounting systems were sophisticated enough to track spending in minute detail, but they weren't configured to measure cost avoidance or operational effectiveness. As a result, many of the base's most valuable activities appeared wasteful when viewed through the lens of traditional budget analysis. Chief, has anyone ever tried to modify the accounting procedures to capture these kinds of savings? Several people have made suggestions over the years, but they were told that changing accounting procedures would require approval from multiple levels of headquarters and would take years to implement. As they walked back toward the main part of the base, Sarah's understanding of Norfolk's challenges crystallized. The base wasn't just resistant to change, it was trapped by systems and procedures that discouraged innovation and prevented accurate measurement of performance. People like Williams and Patterson understood the problems and had identified solutions, but they lacked the authority to implement changes, while the people with that authority lacked the detailed knowledge needed to make informed decisions. What concerned Sarah most was the growing evidence that some senior officers were actively working to prevent her from gathering the information needed to understand these dynamics. The resistance she had encountered wasn't just bureaucratic inertia, it was organized opposition to outside evaluation of operations that might not withstand scrutiny. As she returned to her quarters that evening, Sarah realized that her 3-week orientation period was serving a different purpose than she had initially understood. She wasn't just learning about Norfolk's operations, she was uncovering systemic problems that went far beyond simple inefficiency and touched on fundamental questions about accountability, transparency, and leadership. The next morning would bring new challenges, as word of her evening meeting with Williams inevitably reached the senior staff. But Sarah was beginning to form a clear picture of what needed to be changed and why those changes were being resisted. The question now was whether she would be allowed to complete her evaluation before the opposition succeeded in limiting her access to the information she still needed to gather. What she didn't know was that Lieutenant Commander Jackson had already initiated a plan to discredit her findings before she could compile them into a comprehensive report. The real battle for Norfolk's future was about to begin, and Sarah would need all of her skills and experience to navigate the political minefields that lay ahead. Sarah's morning started with an urgent email from Captain Morrison requesting her immediate presence in his office. The tone was formal and terse, lacking the professional courtesy that had characterized their previous communications. As she walked across the base toward the administration building, she noticed several groups of officers engaged in hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when they saw her approaching. Morrison's outer office was unusually busy when Sarah arrived. 3 department heads were seated in the waiting area, including Commander Vance and Lieutenant Commander Jackson. Their expressions ranged from stern to openly hostile, and Sarah realized she was walking into an ambush. Chief Petty Officer Williams looked up from her desk with an expression of concern. "The captain is waiting for you, ma'am," she said quietly. "He's requested that there be no interruptions during the meeting." Sarah knocked on Morrison's door and entered to find him standing behind his desk with a thick folder of papers spread out in front of him. His usual professional demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled anger. "Commander Martinez," he began without preamble, "I've received several disturbing reports about your activities over the past few days. Please have a seat." Sarah sat down carefully, her mind racing through possible explanations for Morrison's sudden change in attitude. "What kind of reports, sir?" Morrison picked up a document from his desk. "According to multiple sources, you've been conducting unauthorized meetings with enlisted personnel, soliciting complaints about base operations, and requesting access to classified financial and operational data without proper clearance." Each accusation was technically accurate but completely mischaracterized the nature of her activities. Sarah realized that someone had been carefully documenting her conversations and presenting them in the most negative possible light. "Sir, my orientation briefing included instructions to familiarize myself with base operations through observation and informal discussions with personnel at all levels. Everything I've done has been within the scope of those instructions." Morrison's expression didn't soften. "What about your request to Commander Patterson for copies of a budget analysis? Or your evening meeting with Senior Chief Williams at an off-site location? Or your questions about procurement procedures that violated operational security protocols?" Sarah felt a cold chill as she realized how thoroughly her activities had been monitored and misrepresented. Patterson had obviously been questioned about their conversation. and someone had been watching her meeting with Williams closely enough to know when and where it had taken place. Sir, I believe there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of my interactions with base personnel. The nature of your interactions, Morrison said, his voice rising, appears to be an unauthorized investigation designed to identify problems and inefficiencies that you can report back to your superiors in Washington.
Is that an accurate assessment? The question was a trap. If Sarah confirmed that she was conducting an evaluation, she would validate the accusations against her.
If she denied it, she would be lying to a senior officer about her actual mission. Sir, I'm here to learn about naval operations as part of my professional development. That necessarily involves asking questions and gathering information about how things work. Morrison leaned forward across his desk. Commander, let me be very clear about something. Norfolk is one of the Navy's premier installations with a record of excellence that spans decades. We don't need outside investigators questioning our procedures or undermining the confidence of our personnel. I understand your concerns, sir, but I haven't questioned anyone's procedures or undermined anyone's confidence, haven't you? Morrison picked up another document. According to this report, you told Senior Chief Williams that base accounting systems weren't capturing important cost savings. You suggested to Lieutenant Park that parts procurement procedures were inefficient. You implied to multiple personnel that current operations could be improved. Each example was an accurate description of conversations Sarah had conducted, but stripped of context, they sounded like direct criticisms of base leadership. She realized that someone had been systematically gathering intelligence on her activities and preparing a case against her. Sir, those conversations were part of my effort to understand how complex systems work in practice. I wasn't making judgments or criticisms. Morrison stood up and walked around his desk to stand directly in front of Sarah's chair. Commander, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Are you here to evaluate Norfolk's operations for the purpose of recommending changes, cuts, or reorganization? The moment Sarah had been dreading throughout her 3 weeks at Norfolk had finally arrived. She could continue to maintain her cover story, but doing so would require her to lie directly to a superior officer about her mission. Alternatively, she could reveal her true authority, but doing so prematurely could compromise her ability to complete her evaluation. Sir, my orders are classified at a level that requires special clearance to discuss. I can tell you that I'm not here to harm Norfolk or to recommend actions that would be detrimental to the base's mission or personnel. Morrison's expression grew even harder. That's not an answer, Commander. That's an evasion. Before Sarah could respond, Morrison's phone rang. He answered it tersely, listened for several moments, then hung up with an expression of surprise. Commander Martinez, he said, his tone suddenly much more formal. I've just been instructed to suspend this meeting and to provide you with any assistance you require to complete your assignment. Sarah felt a wave of relief mixed with apprehension. Someone with significant authority had clearly intervened, but the timing suggested that her situation at Norfolk had attracted attention at the highest levels of command. Morrison returned to his chair and studied Sarah with new interest. It appears that your assignment here carries more weight than I was initially informed. However, that doesn't resolve the concerns raised by my department heads about the impact of your activities on base morale and operations. What specific concerns, sir? Morrison consulted his notes. Commander Vance reports that her pilots are worried about potential changes to training schedules in flight operations. Lieutenant Commander Jackson says enlisted personnel are asking questions about job security and possible base closures. Several department heads are concerned that informal discussions with their subordinates are undermining the chain of command. Sarah realized that the resistance to her presence had evolved into a coordinated campaign designed to make her mission impossible to complete. By spreading rumors about potential downsizing and changes, Norfolk's senior officers were creating exactly the kind of morale and operational problems they claimed her presence was causing. Sir, I haven't discussed training schedules, job security, or base closures with anyone. Most of the concerns you're describing seem to be based on rumors and speculation, rather than anything I've actually said or done. Then where are the rumors coming from? It was a fair question that went to the heart of the political dynamics Sarah had been observing. Someone was deliberately spreading misinformation about her mission in order to generate resistance to her presence, but identifying the source would require her to make direct accusations against specific officers. I don't know, sir. But I would suggest that rumors tend to spread when people feel they don't have accurate information about what's happening around them. Morrison nodded slowly. That's probably true. What do you suggest we do to address the situation? Sarah had been thinking about this problem for days, and she knew that continuing to operate undercover would only make things worse. The time had come to reveal at least part of her actual authority and mission. Sir, I think it would be helpful if I could address some of the senior staff's concerns directly. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting where I can clarify my role and answer questions about my activities. That might be useful, Morrison agreed. I'll set something up for this afternoon. As Sarah left Morrison's office, she encountered Commander Vance and Lieutenant Commander Jackson in the outer office. Both officers watched her carefully as she passed, their expressions suggesting they were trying to gauge whether the meeting had gone as they had hoped. Sarah spent the rest of the morning in her office, preparing for what would essentially be a confrontation with Norfolk's senior leadership. She reviewed her notes from 3 weeks of observations and conversations, organizing them into a coherent picture of the base's strengths, weaknesses, and potential for improvement. The meeting was scheduled for 1400 hours in the main conference room, and Sarah arrived to find 8 department heads seated around the table with Morrison at the head. The atmosphere was tense, with several officers studying documents that appeared to be transcripts of her conversations with various personnel. Morrison opened the meeting with a brief statement about the need for open communication and mutual understanding. Then he turned the floor over to Sarah. "I want to begin," Sarah said, "by addressing some of the concerns that have been raised about my assignment here." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each officer before continuing. "I am not here to recommend base closures, personnel reductions, or elimination of programs. I am not here to criticize anyone's performance or to undermine established authority." Commander Vance leaned forward. "Then, what exactly are you here to do?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would fundamentally change the dynamics of her relationship with everyone in the room. "I'm here to evaluate Norfolk's operations and to recommend ways to improve effectiveness and efficiency. That evaluation will result in a report to senior Navy leadership, but my mandate is to identify opportunities for improvement, not problems to be eliminated." The room fell silent. Lieutenant Commander Jackson was the first to speak. "So you admit that you're conducting an investigation?" "I'm conducting an evaluation," Sarah corrected. "There's an important difference." Jackson's expression was skeptical. "What's the difference?" "An investigation assumes that problems exist and seeks to identify them. An evaluation examines current operations to determine whether they can be improved. The goal isn't to find fault, but to find opportunities." Commander Vance wasn't satisfied with the explanation. "But if you find operations that you consider inefficient or unnecessary, won't you recommend that they be eliminated?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer that was both honest and reassuring. "If I find operations that serve no useful purpose, I might recommend that resources be redirected to more valuable activities. But before making any such recommendation, I would work with the people involved to understand whether there are factors I haven't considered." "What gives you the authority to make recommendations about our operations?" asked Lieutenant Commander Park, the supply officer. Sarah realized that the time had come to reveal the full scope of her authority. "My evaluation is being conducted under the direct authority of the Chief of Naval Operations. My recommendations will be reviewed at the highest levels of Navy leadership." The impact of her statement was immediate and dramatic. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, and Jackson's expression went from skeptical to alarmed. Everyone in the room understood the implications of direct CNO authority. Commander Vance recovered first. "If your evaluation has that level of authority, why wasn't that made clear from the beginning?" "Because," Sarah explained, "evaluations work best when people behave naturally rather than trying to present an artificially positive picture. If everyone had known about my authority from day one, I would have received sanitized briefings and rehearsed demonstrations instead of honest information about how things really work." Morrison, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Commander Martinez, what have you concluded from your 3 weeks here?" Sarah had been dreading this question, because answering it honestly would require her to identify specific problems and deficiencies that would reflect poorly on the people responsible for them. But she also knew that evading the question would undermine her credibility. "I've concluded that Norfolk has dedicated professional personnel who are committed to accomplishing their missions despite systemic obstacles that make their jobs more difficult than necessary."
It was a diplomatically worded assessment that praised the personnel while criticizing the systems, but everyone in the room understood the implications.
"What kind of systemic obstacles?" Vance asked. Sarah consulted her notes. "Procurement procedures that prioritize compliance over effectiveness, accounting systems that measure costs without measuring benefits, communication protocols that discourage information sharing between departments, administrative requirements that consume resources without adding value." Each example was supported by specific documentation from her conversations with operational personnel, but presenting them felt like an indictment of the leadership team sitting around the table. Jackson leaned back in his chair with an expression of resignation. So you're saying that we've been doing everything wrong? Not everything, Sarah replied. Norfolk accomplishes an enormous amount of important work with impressive levels of professionalism and dedication. But there are opportunities to do that work more effectively with the same resources, or to accomplish more work with existing resources. And you think you can identify those opportunities after 3 weeks of observation? Vance's tone was openly skeptical. Sarah had been prepared for this challenge. No, I don't think 3 weeks is enough time to understand an operation this complex. That's why my evaluation period is actually much longer than 3 weeks.
Morrison looked surprised.
How much longer? Sarah paused, knowing that her next statement would fundamentally change her relationship with everyone at Norfolk. I'm not here for an evaluation, Captain. I'm here for a command assignment. The evaluation is part of my preparation to assume authority for implementing the changes that I identify as necessary. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah could hear the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of aircraft engines, but nobody in the room spoke for what felt like several minutes. Finally, Morrison found his voice. What kind of command assignment? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Effective next Monday, I'll be assuming command of Norfolk as the new base admiral. My 3 weeks here have been preparation for that assignment. The revelation that the woman they had been trying to undermine and discredit was about to become their commanding officer sent shockwaves through the room. Commander Vance looked pale. Jackson appeared to be in shock. Several other officers stared at Sarah as if they were seeing her for the first time. Morrison was the first to recover. Admiral Martinez, he said, using her correct rank for the first time, I apologize for any misunderstanding about your assignment. There's no need to apologize, Captain. The situation was designed to be unclear for operational reasons. As Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who would soon be working for her, she realized that the real test of her leadership was just beginning. February. She had spent 3 weeks learning about Norfolk's challenges and opportunities. Now she would have the authority to address them, but she would need the cooperation of people who had spent those same 3 weeks trying to prevent her from succeeding. The next few months would determine whether Norfolk could evolve into the efficient, effective operation that Sarah believed it could become, or whether the resistance to change would prove too strong to overcome. But for the first time since arriving at Norfolk, Sarah felt confident that she had the information, authority, and determination needed to succeed. The change of command ceremony took place on a crisp Monday morning with the entire base personnel formation standing at attention on the main parade ground. Sarah stood on the reviewing platform in her dress white uniform, the gold stripes of a rear admiral gleaming in the morning sun, as Captain Morrison read the official orders transferring command of Naval Station Norfolk to her authority. 3 weeks earlier, she had been the mysterious new girl that everyone whispered about. Now she was Admiral Sarah Martinez, the youngest person ever to command the world's largest naval station, with authority over 50,000 personnel and a budget exceeding $2 billion annually. The ceremony itself was formal and traditional, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in the faces of the officers and enlisted personnel standing before her. Many of them were still processing the revelation that the woman they had tried to dismiss or undermine was now their commanding officer. Others were wondering what changes would come now that she had the authority to implement the improvements she had been quietly documenting. As Sarah stepped forward to deliver her first address as commanding officer, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 15 years earlier, she had been an 18-year-old recruit from a small town in New Mexico, the daughter of a mechanic and a schoolteacher who had never imagined that their daughter would one day command one of the most important military installations in the world. Her rise through the ranks had been marked by a series of challenging assignments where she had been asked to solve problems that others had deemed unsolvable. At Pearl Harbor, she had reorganized supply chain operations that had been plagued by chronic delays and cost overruns. At San Diego, she had implemented new training procedures that had improved readiness rates while reducing expenses. At Mayport, she had led a comprehensive modernization effort that had transformed an aging facility into a model of efficiency and effectiveness. Each assignment had been more challenging than the last, and each had prepared her for the complexity and scope of the challenges she now faced at Norfolk. But none of her previous experience had fully prepared her for the political and organizational dynamics that had emerged during her 3 weeks of evaluation. Sailors, Marines, and civilian personnel of Naval Station Norfolk, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground through the public address system. I am honored to assume command of this outstanding installation and to work alongside the dedicated professionals who make Norfolk the Navy's premier operational base. Sarah paused to look out over the formation, making eye contact with as many individuals as possible.
She could see Senior Chief Williams standing with her maintenance crew, Commander Patterson with her information systems team, and Petty Officer Rodriguez with her motor pool colleagues. These were the people whose insights and expertise had given her the understanding she needed to identify Norfolk's potential for improvement. Over the past 3 weeks, she continued, I have had the privilege of observing your daily work and learning about the challenges you face in accomplishing your missions. I have been impressed by your professionalism, your dedication, and your commitment to excellence despite obstacles that sometimes make your jobs more difficult than they need to be. Sarah could see some stirring in the formation as personnel recognized that she was acknowledging the operational problems they dealt with every day. For too long, those problems had been minimized or ignored by leadership that preferred to present an image of flawless operations rather than address systemic issues. Excellence, however, is not a destination but a journey. The Navy has entrusted us with enormous resources and responsibilities, and we have an obligation to use those resources as effectively as possible in service of our national security mission. She gestured toward the massive aircraft carriers visible in the harbor behind her. The ships, aircraft, and systems we maintain here represent billions of dollars of taxpayer investment and the livelihoods of thousands of military families. We owe it to them and to the American people we serve to ensure that Norfolk operates at the highest possible level of efficiency and effectiveness. Sarah's tone became more direct as she outlined her philosophy of leadership and change. That means we will examine every procedure, every system, and every process to determine whether it serves our mission or merely serves our comfort with familiar routines. We will ask hard questions about why things are done the way they are, and we will be open to changing anything that can be improved. She could see some uncomfortable shifting among the senior officers standing near the reviewing platform. Commander Vance and Lieutenant Commander Jackson looked particularly uneasy, knowing that many of their established procedures would soon be subject to scrutiny and possible revision. But change will not be imposed from above without consultation or consideration of the wisdom and experience of the people who do the actual work. Every proposed modification will be discussed with the personnel most affected by it. Every new procedure will be tested and refined based on practical feedback. And every decision will be guided by a simple question. Does this make us more effective at accomplishing our mission? Sarah's voice grew stronger as she outlined her vision for Norfolk's future. We will eliminate bureaucratic obstacles that waste time and resources. We will streamline procedures that have become unnecessarily complex. We will leverage technology to automate routine tasks so that our personnel can focus on work that requires human expertise and judgment. She paused to let her words sink in before continuing with what she knew would be the most important part of her address. I want to address directly some of the rumors and concerns that have been circulating about potential changes to base operations. Let me be absolutely clear. My goal is not to reduce Norfolk's capabilities or eliminate positions. My goal is to enhance our capabilities and create opportunities for our personnel to contribute at the highest level of their potential. Sarah could see visible relief on many faces in the formation as she dispelled the fears that had been deliberately cultivated during her evaluation period. When we improve efficiency, the savings will be reinvested in better equipment, enhanced training, and improved facilities. When we eliminate unnecessary procedures, we will redirect those resources toward activities that directly support our operational mission. When we modernize our systems, we will create opportunities for our personnel to develop new skills and take on greater responsibilities. The ceremony concluded with the traditional transfer of authority and the playing of the national anthem, but Sarah knew that the real work was just beginning. As the formation dispersed and personnel returned to their duty stations, she was approached by Captain Morrison, who would be staying on as her deputy commander. Admiral, Morrison said, that was an excellent speech. You managed to be both reassuring and challenging at the same time. Thank you, Captain. I meant every word of it. Morrison studied her carefully. The senior staff is understandably nervous about what comes next. Several department heads have asked me about the timeline for implementing changes. Sarah had given considerable thought to this question during her evaluation period. Change will be evolutionary, not revolutionary. We'll start with the most obvious improvements that can be implemented quickly with minimal disruption, then move on to more complex systemic issues.
What would you consider the most obvious improvements? Sarah consulted the mental list she had been compiling for 3 weeks.
Parts procurement procedures that can reduce aircraft maintenance delays. Accounting system modifications that can better track cost savings from repair operations. Communication protocols that can improve coordination between departments. Administrative requirements that can be simplified or eliminated. Each item on her list was based on specific problems she had documented during her conversations with operational personnel. More importantly,
Each represented an opportunity to demonstrate that change could improve rather than disrupt daily operations. Her first staff meeting as commanding officer was scheduled for that afternoon, and Sarah used the morning to review the comprehensive analysis she had prepared based on her 3 weeks of observation. The document was over 100 pages long and contained specific recommendations for improvements to virtually every aspect of Norfolk's operations. But Sarah had learned enough about organizational psychology to know that presenting all of her recommendations at once would overwhelm her staff and generate resistance rather than cooperation. Instead, she would introduce changes gradually, building momentum and confidence through early successes before tackling more complex challenges. The staff meeting took place in the main conference room where Sarah had revealed her true identity just 4 days earlier. The same 8 department heads were seated around the table, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where before there had been skepticism and resistance, now there was nervous attention and careful courtesy. Sarah opened the meeting by acknowledging the unusual circumstances of her appointment. I know that my evaluation period created confusion and concern about my intentions. I want to begin by thanking all of you for your cooperation during that period. Even when you weren't certain about my role or authority, Commander Vance spoke first. Admiral, we appreciate your earlier assurances about job security and operational continuity. But I think all of us would benefit from a clearer understanding of your specific plans for changes to our operations. It was a fair request, but Sarah knew that providing too much detail too quickly could create new problems. My approach will be to work with each department to identify specific improvements that can be implemented without disrupting ongoing operations, rather than impose changes from above. I want to collaborate with your subject matter expertise to find solutions that work in practice, not just in theory. Lieutenant Commander Jackson looked skeptical. What if we believe that current procedures are already optimized and don't need to be changed? Sarah had expected this question and had prepared an answer that was both diplomatic and firm. Then we'll examine the data together and determine whether that assessment is accurate. But I should point out that every organization can benefit from periodic review, especially when that review is conducted by people with fresh perspectives. She pulled out a folder containing her initial recommendations. To give you a concrete example, I'd like to discuss the parts procurement procedures that affect aircraft maintenance schedules. Sarah outlined the specific delays that Senior Chief Williams had documented, the alternative suppliers that Commander Patterson's system had identified, and the potential cost savings that could be achieved through procedural modifications. The current system requires all parts to be ordered through a centralized procurement office that processes requests in the order received, regardless of operational priority, she explained. Aircraft sit grounded waiting for $50 components, while the same components are available from alternative suppliers who could deliver them within days instead of weeks.
Commander Vance looked surprised.
I wasn't aware that alternative suppliers were available for critical components. The information is available in your logistics management system, Sarah replied. But current procedures don't include provisions for accessing that information during procurement decisions. Lieutenant Park, the supply officer, shifted uncomfortably. Changing procurement procedures would require coordination with multiple headquarters officers and could take months to implement. Sarah had anticipated this objection as well. That's true if we try to change the entire system at once. But we can implement pilot programs for specific categories of components while working through the bureaucratic process for larger changes. She outlined a specific proposal that would allow maintenance supervisors to request expedited procurement for critical aircraft components, using alternative suppliers when primary sources couldn't meet operational requirements. The proposal included safeguards to prevent abuse while giving operational personnel the flexibility they needed to keep aircraft mission ready. This sounds reasonable in principle, Commander Vance admitted, but I'd want to see detailed procedures before implementing any changes.
Of course, Sarah agreed.
I'm not asking anyone to make changes based on general concepts. Every modification will be documented, tested, and refined before full implementation. The discussion continued for 2 hours, covering similar issues in other operational areas. Sarah presented each problem as an opportunity rather than a criticism, and she emphasized that solutions would be developed collaboratively rather than imposed unilaterally. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted from defensive to curious. Several department heads asked questions about timeline and implementation procedures, indicating that they were beginning to see the proposed changes as potentially beneficial rather than threatening. As the meeting concluded, Sarah made an announcement that surprised everyone. Before we adjourn, I want to let you know about a decision I've made regarding personnel assignments. She looked around the table to ensure she had everyone's attention. Senior Chief Williams will be promoted to Master Chief and assigned as my senior enlisted advisor.
Commander Patterson will be appointed as Deputy Chief of Staff for Systems Integration. Petty Officer Rodriguez will be promoted to Chief Petty Officer and assigned as liaison between the operational work centers and the command staff. The promotions and assignments sent a clear message about the kind of personnel Sarah valued, people who understood operational realities, who could identify problems and solutions, and who weren't afraid to speak honestly about challenges they encountered. Lieutenant Commander Jackson looked uncomfortable. Admiral, what about existing personnel assignments and promotion lists? Existing assignments will remain in place unless individuals request transfers or unless operational requirements dictate changes, Sarah replied. These new positions are additions to current staffing, not replacements. Over the following weeks, Sarah implemented her improvement plan systematically and deliberately. Each change was small enough to avoid disrupting ongoing operations, but significant enough to demonstrate tangible benefits. The parts procurement pilot program reduced aircraft maintenance delays by 40% within the first month. Simplified reporting requirements freed up administrative personnel to focus on more valuable activities. Modified scheduling procedures eliminated conflicts that had been causing overtime costs and operational inefficiencies. More importantly, each successful change built momentum for additional improvements. Personnel who had initially been skeptical about modification to established procedures began suggesting their own ideas for enhancements. Senior Chief Williams, now Master Chief Williams, proved to be an invaluable bridge between the command staff and the operational work centers. Her promotion had sent a message throughout the enlisted community that expertise and honesty were valued over political considerations. Commander Patterson's new role allowed her to implement the data analysis capabilities that had been ignored for years. For the first time, Norfolk's leadership had real-time visibility into operational efficiency, cost-effectiveness, and resource utilization across all departments. Chief Rodriguez became the voice of the operational personnel in command decision-making, ensuring that proposed changes were evaluated by the people who would actually implement them. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than procedural. Norfolk developed a reputation as an installation where good ideas were welcomed regardless of their source, where problems were addressed rather than ignored, and where personnel were encouraged to contribute to continuous improvement. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some senior officers remained resistant to change and had to be counseled or reassigned. Certain procedural modifications required extensive coordination with higher headquarters. Budget constraints limited the scope of some planned improvements. But by the end of Sarah's first year as commanding officer, Norfolk had become a model of operational excellence that other installations sought to emulate. Aircraft availability rates improved by 15%. Administrative costs decreased by 20%, while service quality increased. Personnel retention rates rose to the highest levels in the base's history. More importantly, Norfolk had become a place where people enjoyed coming to work because they felt their contributions mattered and their expertise was valued. The rumor mill that had once spread fear and uncertainty now buzzed with excitement about new projects and opportunities. The most dramatic symbol of the transformation came when Norfolk was selected to host a visit by the Chief of Naval Operations herself. Admiral Patricia Hamilton toured the facilities, met with personnel at all levels, and observed operations that had become showcases of efficiency and innovation. At a ceremony attended by hundreds of Norfolk personnel, Admiral Hamilton presented Sarah with the Legion of Merit for exceptional leadership and operational excellence. Admiral Martinez, she said during the presentation ceremony, represents the kind of leadership the Navy needs for the 21st century. She has demonstrated that excellence is achieved not through adherence to rigid procedures, but through intelligent adaptation of those procedures to serve our mission more effectively. As Sarah accepted the award, she looked out over the assembled personnel and reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 3 years earlier, she had arrived at Norfolk as an unknown quantity, dismissed by many as just another mystery assignment from Washington. The resistance she had encountered had been real and sometimes intense. People had questioned her authority, undermined her efforts, and spread rumors about her intentions. But that resistance had also taught her valuable lessons about the importance of communication, collaboration, and patience in implementing organizational change. Most importantly, it had reinforced her belief that every organization contains the seeds of its own improvement in the form of dedicated personnel who understand both the challenges and the solutions. The key to successful leadership is not imposing change from above, but creating an environment where those solutions can emerge and be implemented. As the ceremony concluded and personnel began returning to their duties, Master Chief Williams approached Sarah with a smile. "Admiral," she said, "I have to ask you something I've been wondering about for 3 years." "What's that, Master Chief?"
Did you always know you were going to be our commanding officer when you first arrived here? Or were you genuinely conducting an evaluation? Sarah laughed, remembering her first day at Norfolk when she had been just another new girl trying to figure out how things worked. Both, actually. I knew I was being considered for command, but the evaluation was real. If I had concluded that Norfolk's problems were too entrenched to solve, or if I had determined that the personnel weren't committed to improvement, the Navy would have assigned someone else. Williams nodded thoughtfully. So we were essentially auditioning for the right to be led by you? More like demonstrating that you deserve leadership that would help you achieve your potential, Sarah replied. Norfolk always had outstanding personnel. What it needed was a command structure that would unleash that potential instead of constraining it. As Sarah returned to her office that afternoon, she found a message waiting from the Chief of Naval Operations requesting a brief on the Norfolk transformation for presentation to other installation commanders. The Navy wanted to understand how the changes had been implemented and whether similar improvements could be achieved at other bases. Sarah spent the rest of the day preparing a summary of lessons learned from her 3 years at Norfolk. The most important lesson, she realized, was that organizational excellence isn't achieved through perfect systems or procedures, but through creating cultures where people are empowered to identify problems, propose solutions, and implement improvements. The second lesson was that resistance to change is often based on legitimate concerns about job security, operational disruption, and loss of autonomy. Addressing those concerns honestly and directly is more effective than trying to overcome resistance through authority or mandate. The third lesson was that sustainable change requires broad-based support from personnel at all levels. Changes imposed from above without consultation or buy-in are likely to be abandoned as soon as leadership attention shifts elsewhere. As she finished her report, Sarah realized that her time at Norfolk was coming to an end. Her success had attracted attention from the highest levels of Navy leadership, and she was being considered for promotion to Vice Admiral, an assignment to the Pentagon where she would help implement similar transformation efforts throughout the fleet. The prospect was both exciting and daunting. Norfolk had been a single installation with specific challenges and opportunities. The Navy as a whole was a vast organization, with hundreds of installations, thousands of personnel, and complex political and budgetary constraints. But Sarah had learned that the same principles that had worked at Norfolk could be applied at any scale. Respect for expertise regardless of rank, commitment to continuous improvement, and focus on mission effectiveness over bureaucratic convenience. As she prepared to leave Norfolk for her new assignment, Sarah reflected on the irony of her journey. 3 years earlier, people had tried to take out the new girl because they saw her as a threat to their comfortable routines and established authority. Now, as she prepared to take those same principles to the highest levels of Navy leadership, Sarah realized that being underestimated had been one of her greatest advantages. It had allowed her to observe, learn, and build relationships before people understood the scope of her authority and intentions. The Navy was about to discover that the woman they had once dismissed was exactly the kind of leader they needed for the challenges ahead. And Sarah Martinez was ready to prove that excellence is always possible when people are given the opportunity, authority, and support they need to achieve their potential.